Willow.com presents this unabridged recording of Wambu, the Chieftain's Son, written by Piet Prins, narrated by Craig Roberts. Chapter 1. Bagging a Possum. Wambu was sitting up straight in the women's longhouse. Suddenly, he shivered all over, though he wasn't at all cold. The longhouse, covered with a palm leaf roof, was pitch black inside. It was the middle of the night, and the darkness was thick, but the boy knew exactly who was sleeping next to him. Beside him were his two sisters, and beyond them, his mother. There were many more women and children sleeping and snoring in this women's longhouse. Why was he awake, anyway? Some strange sound must have alerted him. But maybe it had only been a dream. Or had it been the hunting horn of a hostile tribe of headhunters? The idea lingered for a moment, and Wambu shuddered. But that was impossible. The whole village would have been in a panic by now. More likely, it had been an evil spirit tiptoeing around outside the women's longhouse, looking for a hole to slip through. A hole would mean disaster. Wambu's back touched the house wall, made of thin tree trunks and sturdy branches, and completely sealed against the night outside. But then Wambu's hand found a little hole between the branches. He was worried, for a spirit needed only a tiny peephole to climb through. The minute he discovered it, he would slip inside. The floor of the longhouse was covered with dry grass. Wambu collected a handful and stealthily crawled back to the hole in the wall. But curiosity overcame fear. Before he patched the hole, he peered outside. The first light of dawn would come any time now. The night had died already, but the morning had not yet been born. From where Wambu lay, he could see the whole clearing in the rainforest which surrounded their small village. From early evening until just after midnight it had rained, and Wambu could hear the gurgling sounds of the swollen rivers. Mist banks drifted up among the enormous tree trunks. Those moving, translucent shapes, were they spirits rising up out of the water? Something whirred past his head. He jumped. Then he had to laugh. It was only a kalong, an enormous bat. Suddenly there came a new sound, and all his fears vanished. The morning bird sang, proclaiming the coming of dawn. It wouldn't be long now before the sun got up to drive away all the night enemies and evil spirits. At ease, Wambu lay down again, and soon he was sleeping. When he woke up much later, the sun had climbed high in the sky. All around him children were playing and shouting excitedly, sometimes angrily. The air inside the longhouse had grown stale during the long, humid night. In fact, it wasn't really air anymore, it was just plain stench. But Wambu never noticed it, having grown used to that sort of thing. He figured he must have slept in. He didn't see either his mother or his two sisters, and concluded they must be outside. There was no need to wash. He wore only a short grass skirt, more an apron, actually, and he hated washing like the plague. Anyway, it always rained in the jungle, and occasionally he'd take a dip in the river. Still, water wasn't one of his favorite things. Wambu stepped over some sleeping bodies to the entrance. He paused at the top of the steps for a moment and looked around him. There was no longer any trace of morning mist. Leaves overhead filtered the fiercely bright sunlight, but Wambu still had to blink his eyes to get them used to the burst of light. Then he spotted his mother. She had made a fire and was heating a large stone in the middle of it. Just as Wambu stepped down to the ground, she lifted the stone from the fire with 2 pieces of wood. She transferred it to a pail made of the sheaths of palm leaves. The pail contained sago porridge. Wambu's 2 sisters licked their lips as they watched the contents with covetous eyes. Feeling sudden sharp hunger, Wambu hurried over to his mother. Just then something ran in front of his feet. Their pig, a young one, a big piglet. Wambu tripped over him and fell forward as the pig squealed loudly and scuttled away. Although Wambu tried to maintain his balance, he fell on the porridge pail, which promptly tipped over. Startled, Wambu set it up straight. Then he picked himself up and looked offensively at his mother. She was screeching at him for having spilled the porridge and for being so careless about their precious pig. Pigs were a luxury and were treated with the same care as children.
"Now there's not enough porridge left, and there's no more sago either. Just for that, you are getting nothing,"
his mother sputtered. Wambu didn't reply. At least he was lucky to escape a thrashing. However, hunger was just as bad. Maybe worse. With his finger he picked at what remained of the porridge lying on the ground. Soon Caricio, Wambu's father, stepped from the men's longhouse. He put the pail to his mouth and drank as much porridge as he could hold. After that, it was Mother's turn, and the leftovers were for Wambu's sisters. Wambu just sat there, looking dejected. There was nothing left for him. His father had already been told what had happened and looked at him angrily. After breakfast, his mother complained that the supply of sago was all gone. Sago happened to be their most important staple. Unless they got more, they'd go hungry. Wambu's dad got up and motioned Wambu to follow him. Quickly, the boy got up, knowing what had to be done. His father first walked to the men's longhouse to pick up some tools. Wambu wasn't allowed in. He wouldn't be able to live there until later, until he'd grown up. But that couldn't stop him from peeking inside. It seemed pitch black inside the windowless building, but after a few seconds his eyes were used to the darkness, and he could make out a few things. He could see a long row of human skulls hanging from one of the walls. Some of them had been sculptured with clay to make the faces look real. Others had been smoked over an open fire until they were brownish black. In the sockets where the eyes used to be were red leaves. An outsider might have been disturbed at the sight, but it didn't bother Wambu. Every member of the community was proud of those skulls. They were a testimony to the tribe's power. They also protected the tribe, because the spirits of those slain enemies were now forced to perform services for the inhabitants of this little village. There were other skulls belonging to the tribe's ancestors, but they were displayed in a different part of the longhouse. Wambu didn't have much time to look around because soon his dad came out and was ready to go. He was carrying a stone axe, a stone knife, a long bow with arrows, and a fishing spear. Wambu was given the knife and the spear to carry. Proud as a peacock, he marched out behind his dad, feeling like a man. They walked into the jungle, which soon closed in around them. Behind them, the village seemed to have been swallowed up by thick tropical vegetation. Incredibly big trees loomed all around them. Long, sinewy vines crawled up the tree trunks and looped down haphazardly among the branches. On the forest floor grew more vegetation, lush bushes and enormous ferns. All in all, it was an untidy mass of more kinds of plants, shrubs, and trees than you could think of. Despite the thick, almost impenetrable jungle, Wambu's father had no trouble finding his way. He knew the jungle paths from memory, and although a path could be swallowed up by the jungle in a fortnight, he always knew where to go. Only once or twice did he use his axe to cut his way through the shrubs and vines. Wambu was very proud of his father. He had collected quite a few heads himself. He was brave and foxy. Wambu wanted to be just like him when he grew up. In the meantime, he kept a sharp watch for a sago palm tree, one that was tall and ripe enough for chopping. With any luck, they'd have enough sago for weeks. Food. It wasn't something Wambu wanted to think about just now. How could he have been so stupid? Could it have been an evil spirit after all? One that avenged himself on Wambu because the boy had plugged the only access to the longhouse? The more he thought about it, the surer Wambu became. From his parents and other adults, he knew about the terrible power of demons and evil spirits. There were strong, menacing spirits living in the river who could reach out and grab you by the leg and drag you down under to the bottom. The jungle hid other demons, ones that lived in trees. You had to be especially careful at night, because that was when the spirits loved to roam about and work their evil on the living. They could make you sick or even kill you if they chose. Wambu had found out that life was very difficult. In addition to the demons, there were other foes. In fact, anybody who didn't belong to their tribe was an enemy, and enemies could be waiting in ambush anywhere, behind any tree, any shrub, in any little valley. But that didn't trouble Wambu too much just now. After all, his dad would protect him, and if the evil spirits came, well, Sendivar would know what to do with them. Sendivar, one of the oldest members of the tribe, was the witch doctor. He had connections with the world of spirits and knew curses and incantations which gave him power over both people and demons. Frankly, Wambu was afraid of the old witch doctor. Still, it was a good thing that Sendivar was around to protect the people in the village. While Wambu pondered the world of the spirits and the power of the old witch doctor, he kept his eyes wide open. They came upon a swampy section of the jungle, and their feet sank away in the wet soil. Leeches clung to Wambu's legs, and small but energetic mosquitoes attacked him from all sides. He peeled off the leeches and tried to wave off the mosquitoes while hurrying after his dad, who was plunging on ahead of him through the swamp. The forest floor began to rise again, and the vegetation grew less thick. Suddenly, Wambu's dad pointed to the left, where he had spotted a sago palm ripe for the harvest. Wambu's father attacked the tree with his stone axe, and it wasn't long before it came tumbling down. Then he removed the crown, leaving only the trunk, which he cut in half, revealing the white marrow inside. Chopping and cutting was hard work, no doubt about it, and before long Wambu's father was covered with sweat. Wambu helped as best he could, meanwhile hacking off some of the white fibers and popping them into his mouth. Chewing them relieved the most intense hunger pangs. Finished with the cutting, Wambu's father said, "I'm going to get some people to help carry it. You stay here." His father left the long bow and arrows behind, taking only the stone axe in case he ran into trouble. Wambu continued to hack away at loose pieces of fiber to chew. Then he picked up the bow, which was much larger than he was. The string was very taut and could probably send an arrow clear back to the village. There was also a whole bunch of arrows, some designed for birds, others for people or large animals. Wambu didn't have a bow of his own yet, but he had practiced often enough to be a good shot. He armed the weapon and pushed the bow forward. Somewhere high above in the branches, a couple of eclectus parrots were chattering back and forth, and a crowned dove darted from one treetop to another. Should he see if he could bag a bird? He was sorely tempted, but he didn't dare. Probably he would miss, and then his dad would be enraged that he had lost an arrow, and his friends back in the village would laugh and jeer at him when they heard about it. He was just about to put the arrow away when he heard a rustling sound behind him. Jungle sounds are legion, and Popways know them all. Wambu had learned to recognize quite a few of the sounds, but he wasn't sure what kind of an animal this could be. Or was it perhaps an enemy trying to sneak up behind him? With nerves coiled tight, he wheeled quickly and silently. Though he didn't see anything suspicious, he didn't like the looks of things. Silently he slipped behind a shrub. Suddenly the jungle had become ominous again, heavy with death and decay. There it was again. Gingerly, Wambu drew some of the leaves aside and peeked out to where the sound was coming from. Then he saw something moving along the bark of a tree. Instantly he recognized a possum. its light fur contrasting sharply with the dark tree trunk. Slowly the animal made its way up the tree. Then it wrapped its long, sinewy tail around a branch and swung its body to the top of it. The possum had discovered a bird's nest and was calmly walking over to it to eat the young. Wambu was shaking with excitement. He had to have that possum. Cautiously he eased himself back, reached for the bow and arrows, and aimed at the white object on top of the branch. The possum had gone rigid. Had it heard something? Its round, beady eyes darted in all directions. Quickly, Wambu released the arrow. A split second later, the possum was impaled. After rocking back and forth briefly, it fell from the branch, its legs thrashing about wildly. Then it landed at the base of the tree. Cheering wildly, Wambu jumped up. He charged forward and thrust aside the ferns to see the animal lying on the ground. It was dead. The arrow had pierced its heart cleanly. Proudly, Wambu picked up his catch. Now he could show everybody what a sharpshooter he was. All his friends and his sisters, too, would have to admire him. His dad would praise him, and his mother wouldn't be mad anymore, because this meant meat on the table. He waited impatiently for his father's return. After what seemed an eternity, he heard some rustling in the trees, and presently his father and 5 other Papuas stepped out of the foliage. Wambu's face was all smiles as he showed his father the possum and basked in the praise of his father's companions. "That boy of yours is growing up to be quite a man. He'll soon be going head-hunting, I should think," one of the men said. "That'll be some time yet," his father temporized, but he was secretly pleased that the other villagers were so generous in their praise for his son. Now the sago palm had to be transported to the village. 3 men took 1/2 of the tree and hoisted it to their shoulders, while the other 3 took the second half. Wambu had to carry the weapons as well as his possum. That wasn't much of a load for him. The others, however, had a hard time of it, and it was quite a while before they were back to the village. Half of the tree was for Wambu's dad, and the other half went to the other men. His mother was delighted with the food, and she heaped praises on her son. When a couple of Wambu's friends came up to ask him what had happened, he told them how he had shot the possum, half hidden behind some trees, from a distance of no less than 150 paces. It didn't matter very much that he was better at storytelling than he was at shooting. The more he was asked about his exploits, the more incredible his feat became. A boy called Taja, a year older than Wambu, was bitterly jealous. He sneered at Wambu's story, claiming that Wambu had found the possum lying dead on the ground and had shoved an arrow through its body. Wambu became furious. "You're lying, you mangy rat!" he shouted indignantly. The other boys, always itchy to see a fight break out, spurred Wambu and Taja on. Wambu was just ready to tangle with Taja when his mother called him away. He had to help beat the sago. Humiliated, he walked away, hounded by the jeers and catcalls of his enemy. Wambu was ashamed especially because he thought beating sago was woman's work. Children had to help too, and Wambu thought it was all right for the girls, but why should he, heroic slayer of the possum, have to do the domestic chores? His mother was of a different mind. She gave him a wooden mallet and ordered him to work. Although angry and petulant when he started, he soon got caught up in a rhythm and forgot his fury. He pounded the marrow of the sago trunk into little pieces, and then with his hand scooped the supply onto a large palm leaf lying beside him. His mother worked at the other end of the tree trunk, and the girls watched carefully. Not far away, Coricio dozed on his backside in the shade of a large tree. He figured he'd done enough work for the day, simply chopping down the tree and carrying it back to the village. After a while, Mother got up, saying to Maui, Wambu's youngest sister, "Here, you try it." The older sister, Melania, had to help Mother wash the sago and knead the dough. The chopped fibers were scooped into a large tray woven from the sheaths of palm leaves. There was water in the tray. Wambu's mother and Melania kneaded until the meal separated from the fibers and sank to the bottom. The floating fibers were scooped away with a sieve. Wambu just kept hammering. Maui wasn't too good at it yet, but at least she was trying hard. Often, Melania came to fetch the raw supply that Wambu and Maui had separated from the tree trunk. This went on for hours, but when they were finally finished, they had a huge supply of sago flour. Mother then transferred the dough into cylinders made of woven palm leaves. She set aside a small portion in an earthenware cake form which could make 9 sago cakes at a time. It was much easier to preserve cakes than wet flour. When they had finally finished, Wambu was very tired, as were his sisters, but at least they had a delicious meal to look forward to. His mother started to skin the possum. She tanned at the hide with some leaves that contained ascorbic acid and then hung it out in the sun to dry. Her husband had already told her that he wanted a beautifully decorated headband made out of it. Wambu didn't think that was right. It was, after all, his catch. But he had enough sense not to argue with his father. The meat was impaled on a wooden stake and roasted above a small fire. It wasn't the most efficient way of roasting meat. It was still half raw when Wambu's mother took it down and divided it up. But Wambu thought it was delicious. With blood and grease running down his chin, he devoured his portion greedily. They also ate some pieces of sago and a kind of wild endive that had been toasted between hot stones in the fire. It was, by all accounts, a most delicious meal, a celebration. And this time Wambu, almost a full-fledged member of the family, got his share. Wambu had almost forgotten his argument with Tasha. Deeply satisfied, he relaxed in the sun that beat down on his naked body. It was terribly hot in the jungle, but that didn't seem to bother the Papuans. Time passed slowly. Most of the village men had gone into the jungle or to the river to gather food. They would all be home shortly before dark. Wambu had taken the possum's largest bone to carve into a dagger. For hours he sat in the late afternoon sun, shaping the bone with a stone knife and other primitive instruments. It was going to be a beautiful dagger, the first he had ever made. Gingerly, he prodded its point into his arm. It was as sharp as a pin. The day had turned out to be a great success after all, Wambu reflected. Just this morning, when he had tripped over the pig, it had seemed like a disaster was going to strike. At once he had linked it to evil spirits. Well, he had sure been wrong about that. Still, you had to stay on your toes. There were thousands of dangerous demons, and they were not particular whether they got a young boy or a grown man. But there was always Sendovar, expert in the magic arts, and he would know what to do with evil spirits. Half dozing in the warm sun, Wambu lazily tooled away at his new weapon. How long had he been at it? He didn't know. He didn't care. Wrapped in the comfortable warmth of New Guinean rainforests, a boy didn't worry about minutes or hours. Eventually, the sun started to go down, and the forest shadows grew longer and longer. Gradually, too, the men started to drift back to the village from their daily hunt. It wouldn't be long now before night fell again. Chapter 2. Hossevits, the Renegade. Suddenly, pandemonium erupted on the other side of the river. The village men jumped and ran toward the source of the noise, and soon they saw a group of laughing, excited men emerging from the jungle. They escorted someone called Hossevits. Hossevits, who loved to wander, had disappeared only a few months before. He would take his fast little proa down any river, much further than anyone else in the village. It was dangerous, to be sure, because he would often trespass on other tribes' hunting grounds. Caught doing that, he could very well be killed and eaten. But Hossevits was very strong and not easily frightened, and he was always armed to the teeth when he went out on one of his journeys. He always took some merchandise with him, too, items he could trade, like ornately carved shields, necklaces of dog's teeth, or daggers made from cassowary bone. He would exchange them for yams, tobacco, or other goods. This time, however, Hasovitz had been away for so long that everyone thought he was dead. And here he was back again. His face beamed as he walked very proudly. He no longer wore the traditional short grass apron, but a pair of shorts. In his right hand he wielded an axe, not an ordinary stone axe like everybody else had, but a beautiful steel axe. The witch doctor, Sendivar, had a steel axe, as did Moro, the strongest man and the uncrowned chieftain in the village. But Hasovitz's axe was even finer, and he seemed to have more precious items in the net slung on his back. The villagers stared at him with covetous and curious looks. The men wanted to escort the renowned traveler to their longhouse so he could tell them his adventures. But the women protested vehemently. They were not allowed in the men's house, but they definitely wanted to hear Hasovitz's story. Sendivar decided it for them. "Make a fire out here," he ordered. "The whole village has to hear this." He stole jealous glances at Hasovitz's axe. It seemed he might be scheming again. The women and children were delighted with Sendivar's decision. They could look forward to an entertaining evening. The villagers started hauling wood toward the central clearing, and soon they had a bonfire roaring. Then they sat down circled around the fire, the men up front and the women and children behind them. Some of their camp pets, mostly skinny dogs and the occasional pig, joined the human throng. Wambu found himself a good spot beside a couple of friends and not too far from the inner circle occupied by the men. Suddenly something nudged his side. He looked and saw the snout of a pig, the one he had tripped over that morning. The insolent beast was trying to push through the crowd to see what was going on. Wambu couldn't resist the temptation. His hand closed around the pig's tail, and he gave it a violent jerk. The animal gave a deafening squeal and bolted through the ring of women and children, across the legs of Moro and Sendivar, and out the other side. The men grumbled indignantly as the women and children doubled up laughing. In short, it was chaos all around. Wambu's mother had, of course, recognized her pig. She glanced at her son. Was Wambu responsible for this mischief? But Wambu had a look of pure innocence about him. He knew very well he'd be tanned unmercifully if she thought he was responsible. Fortunately, attention was deflected from him and the pig to something else. Moro tossed some more wood on the fire, and Sendivar said, "Hasovitz, tell us what happened to you." Sucking air into his lungs, Hasovitz sat back in comfort. He was the hero. The focus was on him now. Proudly, he clutched his axe. As the bright red sun sank behind the treetops of the rainforest, the evening sky turned scarlet, streaked with oranges and purples. The green of tree trunks and bushes deepened and then grew black and ominous. Crickets began to chirp in the grasses. A huge flock of kalongs winged by overhead, and high above that, a lone white heron was leaving its fishing by the river to return to its nest high in the trees. The people sitting around the campfire paid no attention either to the forest or to the birds above. They were oblivious to the strange, mysterious magic of a tropical evening in the rainforest. Instead, they were engrossed in Hasovitz's story of the strange world outside. The bonfire's flames danced eerily on Hasovitz's face as he opened his mouth and began to talk. "Many days I left our village. I took with me the skins of birds of paradise and 2 ornate shields, a number of daggers made of cassowary bone, and many other precious things. I wanted to go far afield this time, further than any of our ancestors had ever gone." Sendivar frowned disapprovingly and rudely interrupted the hero. "Don't anger the spirits of our ancestors. They were great warriors. Some of them journeyed as far as the mountains in the north and the great water in the south, the beginning of the world of shadows." The other men mumbled their agreement. Sendivar was always right. He knew all about the ancestors and the world of shadows and spirits. But Hasovitz wasn't about to be outdone. Disregarding the interruption, he continued, "I took my canoe past many villages, but I never went to shore. Whenever I got hungry, I ate some of the sago cakes I had taken with me, and for the rest, I caught fish and crabs in the river. I roasted them on glowing stones in the fire. At night, I slept either in trees or on the ground under a lean-to of atop. That's how I made it far to the south. I came across new villages I had never seen before. I saw many gardens of sago, and also many gardens and fields with fruit that we hardly ever see around here: papaya, lebo, cassava, and sugarcane. Then I came to a large town on the river and saw a proa that was as big as a house. There was nobody to row the boat, and it also didn't have any sailors. It moved as if by magic. There were white men on the proa, and they called me over and wanted to give me some tobacco. At first I was afraid, I have to admit, but I finally went aboard that big boat, and the white men didn't do me any harm. I saw many great and wonderful things. These strange white men have sticks of magic that smoke and spit fire. They use them to kill people and animals from a great distance. I also saw a little box which had a spirit in it that talked and made music whenever the white magicians wanted. I traded all my goods with them. That's how I got this beautiful axe, a knife, a supply of tobacco, and many more things. The white men didn't do me any harm at all. They are very rich and very powerful. I also spoke with a few people from the village who have learned a lot from the white men and who have come to live a different life altogether. The villagers were astonished and deeply impressed by Hasavit's story. The only one who wasn't pleased was Sendivar. In fact, judging from his dark looks, he was becoming angrier all the time. And when Hasavits told them about how the other villagers had changed as a result of the white men, Sendivar sprang forward angrily. "You say the white man has done you no harm? They put a curse on you. They're evil. If we're not careful, they'll come here and ruin our lives too." That put a fright into the villagers. An uneasy rumble arose. True, Hasavits had traveled far and seen much, but it was Sendivar, the old witch doctor, who knew everything. Whom should they believe? They had heard rumors about white men before, about their power, but until now not one of them had been in contact with them. Hasavits was about to speak, but the witch doctor silenced him. "Listen," he said decidedly, "and I'll tell you the secret of the white men. They come from afar, far away from across the great water, from the realm of the dead, from even further away than Sorabaha. That's why they're white, the color of ghosts and demons. Only they're not spirits, they're people of flesh and blood. They're sly and terribly evil. You all know that our ancestors were the first people on Earth, and that our land is at the center of the world. That's why by rights everything belongs to us. Our ancestors were very rich and powerful indeed. They knew every secret and every magic mystery. It was only later that white men were made. They were poor, shallow creatures, but somehow they stole our secrets, and with it our power. Now they use that power to push us back further and further, and to steal all our lands and possessions. And in order to make us yield to their power, they have passed a law that says we cannot eat human flesh. The tribes who obey that law can't receive new spiritual power. They become impotent and cowardly. And then it's even easier for the white man to lord it over them." Sendivar fell silent. His keen, sly eyes searched the faces around the fire. He was probably happy at what he saw. The villagers looked sober and troubled, especially the women. One old hag, with not a tooth left in her mouth, screeched,
"Even here it's not like it used to be. Our men were brave heroes who often came home with their enemies' heads. We ate human meat almost every day. That's what gave us our strength and courage. But now months go by without a real hunt. I, for one, haven't tasted a piece of human flesh in months. And look at our village. There aren't half as many people as when I was young. That's because the old rules aren't observed anymore. evil spirits will soon have us in their power."
Finally, her voice dropped off to a murmured incantation. As the witch doctor nodded agreement, most of the men in the front row dropped their heads in shame. Again, Sendivar attacked. "We have to become brave and strong once again, just like our ancestors. If we go back to the old ways, the spirits will favor us. Then our deliverance will come. Soon the white man will be driven away, and then we will once again rule the world. We will have more than enough to eat, not just sago or field mice, but the flesh of human beings from which we get our strength." Eyes around the fire began to burn and glow. They knew exactly what Sendivar was talking about. The old witch doctor dropped his voice. Mysteriously, almost whispering now, he continued. "When the great floods come and cover the whole earth, then he will come, sailing a giant ship from heaven. Mansaran Mangoendi, the Lord of the world, and the one who gave us the laws and the morals to our ancestors, and who taught them how to build houses. He will drive out the intruders and strangers, the interlopers and the enemies, and he will restore wealth and power to his people. But we have to make sure we're ready. Those who willingly allow themselves to be duped by the white men are not worthy to belong to his people." The intensity in his voice was irresistible. Everybody looked at Hasavich with wide-open anger and indignation. The mind of the primitive Papua was easily influenced, and Sendivar knew exactly how to do it. Hasavich didn't move a muscle. His face betrayed nothing, but he realized full well the peril he was in. If the old man were to go on for another 5 minutes, the whole village would come down on him and tear his unfortunate carcass to pieces. They considered him a traitor now. 10 minutes ago he was a hero. Now he was an outcast, and they would eat his flesh simply to placate the spirits. Hasavich was wiser and wilier than most of his fellow villagers. He knew that Sendivar was jealous, especially of the beautiful steel axe that lay in his lap. Jealousy and hatred were the witch doctor's motives. But death was imminent. Hatred lurked in the people's eyes. The lust for blood was on their lips. There was only one thing Hasavich could do. Self-defense would be pointless. He quickly reached into his net with both hands.
"Here's some tobacco,"
he said quickly, and started passing it around to the men sitting beside him. Tobacco! They jumped forward, pushing and shoving each other, and clutching at the coveted pouches lying on the ground. Hasavich threw another handful of packages in the middle of the quarreling men. Then he jumped up, grabbed his axe and net, and disappeared into the darkness. The squabble around the fire lasted until everybody had secured his share of the spoils. The bigger boys looked on enviously, but didn't dare get involved. There was no way the men would tolerate that. The men began to smoke, some with clumsy homemade pipes of wood, while others rolled the tobacco inside a leaf and lit up. Everyone momentarily forgot about Hasavich. Everyone, that is, except the witch doctor. But he realized that this was not the judicious time to send the men out after the adventurer who seemed to have disappeared. The bonfire was starting to die down. The men began to get up and move toward their longhouse. They would probably talk about this for a long time yet, but first they wanted to get away from the women and children, who now began to go to their own longhouse. After a final bustle of activity around the campfire, everyone was gone, leaving the fire to die out by itself. Wambu dawdled for a while, although his mother had already left with Mawe and Melania. He had spotted something, and he wanted to check it out. When Hasavich had reached into his bag to pull out the tobacco, something had fallen to the ground. What could it be? Something magic from the world of the white men? Wambu started to walk around, trying to seem aimless, but gradually he approached the spot where Hasavich had been sitting. It had to be around here somewhere. He drew his foot through the leaves, pulling twigs aside with his toes. Then he quickly stooped and grabbed something. His heart was pounding wildly. "Did you find something?" a boy's voice asked. "I almost had my hands on a big beetle, but I guess he got away," Wambu replied. Luckily, the boy wasn't interested. His back to the boy, Wambu stole a glance at the object he held. It was a small round mirror with a red frame. Wambu had never seen a mirror, and he started visibly when he suddenly saw his face. Of course, he had seen it before as a reflection in the water, but it had never been this clear. So it was a thing of magic from the white man's world. And he had looked at it. Did that mean he was bewitched too, just like Hasavits? Just for a moment he thought he should throw the shiny thing aside. But no, he couldn't do that. Maybe, just maybe, this magic thing would make him strong, mighty, mightier even than Sendivar. He was determined to keep it, even though it might imperil his soul. Suddenly a screech from his mother brought him back to reality.
You come here right away, you mischievous squirt. It's getting dark. Do you want to get strangled by Dimas?
Wambu shuddered. Dimas were the evil spirits of the night. He ran for the women's longhouse and dashed up the rungs. When he got inside, his mother boxed his ears severely, angry because he hadn't come right away. Wambu bent his head and buried his face in his arms. That way, most of the cuffs fell on his curly black hair, which was thick enough to absorb the shocks. As soon as he could, he slipped away to where he slept. There he lay quietly, not moving a muscle. His mother had apparently had enough of it and seemed to be getting ready for bed herself. Wambu's sisters were sleeping already. Wambu didn't feel any pain from the blows, but he was terribly agitated for another reason. He possessed that shiny thing of magic that had once belonged to the white man, and nobody knew about it. The little mirror was in the palm of his hand, hidden by the fingers Wambu wrapped around it. He was no longer afraid of that shiny thing. He knew he did not want to part with it. But that presented a problem. Where would he keep it? He'd have to carry it with him without letting anyone see it. He thought about it for quite a while. Suddenly, he had the answer. He would make a little net of woven plant fibers and keep the mirror in it. He would tie the net around his waist, under his grass skirt. Nobody would ever spot it. He remembered Sendivar's words. Was the white man really that dangerous and evil? Hadn't all the men of the village scrambled and fought for Hasavits' tobacco? Even the witch doctor? If there was nothing wrong with the white man's tobacco, why should that shiny thing do him any harm? Where was Hasavits now? If he showed up again, Wambu would try to find out as much as he could about white men and their magic power. But no one would see his treasure, especially not Sendivar. Chapter 3. Wambu Saves the Renegade's Life. The new day brought rain, a whole morning of it. It wasn't just a drizzle either. It came sheeting down, and there seemed to be no end to it. Wambu trudged on behind his dad through the thick, dripping undergrowth, his feet squished on the soggy ground. Sometimes they sank in right up to his ankle. As they neared the river, the terrain rose and the ground became drier. The rushing rain and the roaring river drowned all other sound. Soon they stood on the riverbank. The greenish-brown water was covered with air bubbles left by huge raindrops pelting the surface of the water. A strong current carried along with it branches, tree trunks, and patches of water plants. Occasionally a fish broke the surface of the water. Just off to their side, 2 herons stood motionless in the shallows. Wambu had been busy that morning. He had gotten up early and disappeared among the trees to hunt for strong fibers to weave into a net for his shiny new mirror. Every once in a while he'd had to stop to look at his own reflection. When he'd found enough, he strung the fibers together, deposited the mirror inside, and tied the net around his waist, careful to hide it under his grass skirt. Later, when he got home, his mother chewed him out for sneaking off, but at least she didn't refuse him a meal. And now he was on his way fishing with his dad, Corisio. They each carried a spear with a long, sharp point, and they had a funnel-shaped net that Corisio would drag behind the boat. The boat, a proa, lay hidden among the foliage at the river's bank. It had been carved out of a tree trunk with a stone axe, and later finely decorated. Wambu was very proud of it, and proud of his dad who could make such a beautiful boat. Together they launched the proa, a very sleek and unsteady craft. But that was no problem. You never sat down in one of those things anyway. You rowed standing up. Each grabbing an oar, they quickly paddled out to the middle of the river. Such a sleek, light craft could move very fast. Then, like a bicycle, it was steady as long as you kept going. His dad tossed the net overboard. They decided to paddle upstream in order to catch as many fish as possible. The rain didn't look like it was going to let up, but that didn't bother Wambu. It rained often in the jungle of New Guinea. Wambu didn't wear any clothes anyway, and his skin would dry fast enough. The net dragged behind them through the gray water. When Corizio hauled it in, it hadn't caught much, only a couple of small ones. But hooked to the rear of the net was a huge crab. Pretty pleased with himself, Wambu's dad seized the animal, broke its legs and pincers off, and tossed it with the rest of the fish on the bottom of the boat. Having stopped paddling, they slipped downstream. Corizio and Wambu peered into the water intently, spears poised for any fish they spotted. One of the two herons was still standing near the riverbank. As the boat drifted close, he leisurely unfolded his wings and gracefully soared into the treetops. Wambu spotted something flashing in the water, and he thrust his spear. Missed it. Just at the last split second, the huge fish zigzagged to escape the oncoming spear. "You're a clumsy oaf," his father remarked disapprovingly. Wambu was upset with himself and a trifle ashamed. When he bagged the possum, he had really felt like a hunter, and he had been thinking that the shiny little thing from the white man's world would act as a good luck charm. Suddenly, he realized again how little he was. Corizio was better at this sort of thing. Twice he fired his spear, and twice he hauled in a sizable fish. At long last, Wambu's luck turned too. He got a big fat one right through the head. The rain was beginning to let up a bit. Soon the sun would break through the cloud cover. The fragile proa cut through the water, with Corizio in the bow keeping a sharp lookout for tree trunks and other perilous obstructions. Suddenly he steered the craft sharply into the middle of the river. When Wambu asked him what was going on, his father pointed silently to something floating in the river not far from the bank. It looked very much like a grayish-green tree trunk, but the minute Wambu saw it, he knew what it was. It was a crocodile. The monster floated motionless with the current, and the only signs of life were two small, sly eyes that didn't miss a trick. He had seen the boat coming and was patiently biding his time. He was in no hurry. With a little bit of luck, his prey might float right into his mouth. But that didn't happen. Corizio's sudden maneuver had turned the proa away. Corizio and Wambu dug in to get away from there fast. Within seconds, they were beyond the crocodile's reach. They fished for another hour or so. Sometimes they met fishermen from their own village, but none of them stopped to chat. Only when Corizio figured they'd caught enough fish did he turn the canoe toward the riverbank and hide it among the bushes. The catch hadn't been half bad. By now, it had stopped raining. The sun had finally broken through, and the jungle steamed. They still had to make their way back to the village, and the going was rough. The soil was soggy and treacherous. Thousands of mosquitoes buzzed incessantly around their heads, and the infernal leeches attached themselves to their legs. It was no picnic, but Corizio was hardened to it, and Wambu was learning. As they approached the village, they heard excited voices. The village women were standing around chattering, and Sendivar was there too. But there were hardly any other males present, because they were out foraging for food. It wasn't long before Wambu and his dad found out what was going on. Apparently, Hasavits had been back. Taking advantage of the men's absence, he had removed his possessions from the men's longhouse and had then disappeared into the forest. Nobody had attempted to stop him, not even the old witch doctor. Hasavits could easily have taken care of him. Still, Sendivar was very angry because he feared that Hasavits might get away. The moment he spotted Corisio, he practically ran toward him. "You know where Hasavits keeps his boat," he said. "He's on his way there now, but he's carrying all his belongings, and that's going to slow him down. Go after him right now, put an arrow in him, and take his head. He's had a spell put on him by the white men, and he wants to go to them. That puts us in danger, because they'll soon concentrate all their evil power on us." Wambu's father hesitated. He had taken a lot of heads in his time, but never one from his own tribesmen. Besides, Hasavits was strong and potentially dangerous. Corisio didn't feel much like it. But the moment the old witch doctor spotted his reluctance, his eyes began to flicker menacingly. He raised his arms high and started to mumble one of his accursed incantations. The women retreated in horror, and Corisio was cowed too. If he didn't do what he was told, the witch doctor would curse him. He gave his fish to Wambu, fetched his stone axe and bow and arrow, and dashed off into the forest. For a minute, Wambu didn't know what to do. He knew he should try to help his dad and maybe get part of the credit, but some voice deep inside him said, "It's not right for Hasavits to die, and you have to help save him." Wambu stood as if nailed to the ground. Nobody knew what was going through him. Suddenly he dashed off after his father. Sendivar seemed satisfied. He was still the boss around here. He had managed to intimidate Corisio, and now his son, a youth true to his tribe, was going to help his father. That's the way it should be, reflected the old witch doctor. Both young and old had to do his bidding. Was Wambu really going to help his father? He himself didn't know. The tension within him had just become too much to bear. He'd had to do something, and that's why he had charged off into the forest. His brain churned madly as he ran down the forest paths. He remembered the look on his dad's face when Sendivar had given him the orders. One thing was sure, his dad didn't really want to kill Hasavits. He was only going to do it because he was afraid of the witch doctor's curse. Wambu suddenly realized how deeply he hated the old man, that powerful but evil witch doctor whom even the brave daredevil Moreau feared. And just as suddenly, Wambu resolved to frustrate Sendivar's plans. But he had to find a way that wouldn't get his dad into trouble. Soon he caught a glimpse of Corisio plowing through the underbrush, and suddenly Wambu had an idea. He turned left away from the river and put on a burst of speed. Knowing the forest like the back of his hand, he knew precisely where his dad was going. If he ran fast enough, he would soon be off to his dad's left, with maybe 100 meters of forest between them. The little dagger he had carved from the possum bone hung from his waist. He yanked it out, stabbed himself in the left arm, and then drew the sharp edge of the knife across his chest several times. Predictably, he began to bleed heavily. At the same time, he started yelling, "Dad! Dad! Help! Hasavits is trying to kill me!" Then he dashed on to put more distance between himself and his father. He never doubted that his father had heard him and recognized his voice, but he had to stall for time. That's why he started running again, changing directions a few times, and all the while making sure he was getting further and further away from the river. He heard his dad call out, "Wambu, where are you?" Well, Wambu decided that was far enough. He dropped to the ground, stabbed himself in the right leg for good measure, and then started wailing pitifully again. It only took his dad a couple of minutes. He came charging through the bushes and trees, waving his axe menacingly, ready to pounce on Hasavits. But Hasavits wasn't there. There was only Wambu, grunting and groaning and grimacing in pain. Corisio yelled in fury, "Where is Hasavits? That's going to cost him his head!" By now, Wambu was getting a little worried. Had he gone too far? But he had to stick to it to the end. "He took off when he saw you coming," Wambu gasped. "He jumped out from behind a tree and came at me. He stabbed me with his knife a couple of times, but I fought back and started shouting for help. He dragged me through the trees, but I managed to get away and tried to run toward you. He came after me, but when he heard you coming, he ran in the other direction." "Which direction?" I don't know." Wambu began to groan again, hoping to distract his father's attention so he wouldn't see through it right away. His father examined his wounds. "Just a few scratches," he growled. "The skin is hardly broken. Is that what you were screaming about? Come on, get up." Wambu got up, feeling plenty of pain. Suddenly he was upset that his dad just pooh-poohed the whole matter. "Come along," Corizio said to him as he headed off toward the river. Wambu limped along slowly so that it took them quite a while to reach the river. His dad never said a word. He seemed to be meditating on something. Every once in a while he would give Wambu a questioning look. The place where Hasavits always docked his boat was empty, and there was neither hide nor hair of Hasavits. Apparently he'd made his getaway. Wambu was careful to conceal his delight, but his father didn't seem too upset about the escape. His anger had completely subsided. They both sat silently at the edge of the river, looking down into the dirty gray water. Suddenly his dad said, "You tricked me. Hasavits was nowhere near you. I didn't see any tracks. Those injuries are your own doing. Why?" Just for a second Wambu was tempted to stick to his story, but he knew it wouldn't hold water. His dad had found him out. But what kind of explanation could he give? He could hardly understand it himself. I don't like Sendivar," he stammered. "He wanted you to kill Hasavits, and Hasavits hasn't done us any harm. So I thought of a way to draw your attention. Also, I was afraid you might get killed." How would his dad react, he wondered. Would he punish him, maybe even kill him? With fear in his eyes, Wambu looked up. His father didn't reply for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was hushed, as if he were afraid of being overheard. "You're afraid of Sendivar. Actually, we all are, even your mother. The only one who isn't is Hasavits, maybe because he's seen more of the world. Sendivar is a very powerful witch doctor. He speaks with the spirits and knows how to control them. He can drive out sickness and protects us from enemies. We can't live without him. Whoever doesn't obey him is cursed and has to die. There's nothing you can do for a man who has a curse on him. I'm glad Hasavits got away, but the witch doctor must never find out what you did. We'll keep on saying that he used the attack on you to make his getaway." Wambu nodded, very happy and relieved that his dad was so understanding. They now shared a secret which no one would ever find out. Back they went to the village. The women clustered around to see what had happened, and seemed terribly disappointed to see Corizio come back empty-handed. The witch doctor joined them, and Corizio began to explain what had happened. He sounded so convincing that Wambu was beginning to believe his own lie. So did the women. They looked at Wambu with a mixture of admiration and compassion because he had defended himself so bravely and paid such a heavy price. Sendivar didn't trust it. He also questioned Wambu, but the boy confirmed his dad's story. In the end, the witch doctor had no choice but to believe it. Anyway, when he saw that it was pointless to go on asking questions, he said, "Now you can see how dangerous the white man is. They've put such a curse on Hasavits that he even attacks his own people. If he ever returns, he'll have to be killed on the spot. Corizio failed this time, but maybe we'll get another chance." Before he walked off, Sendivar cast an ominous glance toward Corizio and his son. The women disbanded, leaving only a few boys and girls to gawk at Wambu. Taja was one of them. He started boasting about what he would have done had he run into Hasavits.
"If Hasavits had attacked me, I would have run him through with my dagger."